March 4th, 1964, Cincinnati, Ohio. 8 p.m. A fire starts in a basement. Nobody panics. Not yet. Wrecking crews had been burning debris all week, clearing space for a new highway. Then the wind shifts. Within minutes, 4 7-story wooden buildings are gone. Flames shoot 200 feet into the night sky. 600 firefighters pour in from across the tri-state. Heat blisters the paint off 3 fire trucks. A crane caught in the inferno melts where it stands. Thousands of Cincinnatians press against police lines, watching the sky turn red. Inside that fire, 70 years of American piano history. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The fire didn't kill Baldwin piano. What killed it was a decision made in a quiet office 15 years later by men in suits who had stopped thinking about music. This is the story of a music teacher who built the greatest piano factory in America. A family that kept it alive through 2 world wars and a depression. And the moment ambition outgrew the instrument that started it all. Dwight Hamilton, Baldwin, was not a businessman. He was a music teacher. Born in 1821 in Erie County, Pennsylvania, he had spent his adult life doing what men like him did in the mid-19th century, traveling from town to town, teaching piano, organ, and violin to the children of families who could afford lessons and wanted their daughters to be refined. He was good at it, patient, principled, a man shaped more by the church than by the market. In 1857, he settled in Cincinnati, Ohio. The city was booming, river trade, meat packing, German immigrants flooding in with their love of music and their willingness to work. Baldwin began teaching, and somewhere between the lessons and the ledgers, he saw something the other music teachers didn't. The families buying instruments weren't just buying music. They were buying identity. A piano in the parlor said something about who you were. It said you had arrived. In 1862, Baldwin opened a music store. His stock included 2 of the most respected names in American piano making, Chickering and Steinway. He was not yet a manufacturer. He was a retailer, a middleman. But he was a middleman with taste, and taste turned out to matter. Business was steady. Then, in 1866, the building burned. Pike's Opera House, where Baldwin had been running his shop on the 2nd floor, caught fire in March of that year and took nearly everything with it. Most of his instrument inventory, gone. A lesser man might have closed up and gone back to teaching. Baldwin reopened. That same year, he hired a bookkeeper. The young man's name was Lucien Woolson. Woolson was 22 years old, raised in Alexandria, Kentucky, just across the Ohio River. He had served in the Civil War, returned home practical, disciplined, with the kind of clarity that comes from having survived something. Where Baldwin saw music, Woolson saw numbers. Where Baldwin thought about quality, Woolson thought about margins. They were not alike in any obvious way. And that, as it turned out, was exactly why it worked. For 7 years, Woolson kept the books and watched the business. He learned how piano dealerships operated, how to manage a sales floor, how to negotiate with suppliers. He was not the kind of man who stayed a bookkeeper for long. In 1873, Baldwin made him a partner. The firm became D.H. Baldwin and Company, and with Woolson now sharing the wheel, the company began to move. They opened a showroom in Louisville in 1877. Indianapolis followed in 1879. Woolson pushed hard on expansion, on building relationships with dealers across the Midwest, on making the Baldwin name mean something in cities where people were just beginning to have enough money to want a piano. By the late 1880s, D.H. Baldwin and Company had become the largest piano dealer in the western United States. Baldwin himself remained what he had always been, a man who believed in the instrument with something close to reverence. He was not flashy. He gave generously to the church. He cared about the way a piano sounded in a room, about the craftsmanship that went into the keys and the hammers and the soundboard. These were not small concerns to him. They were the point. Woolson understood that. He also understood that caring about quality and building a business around quality were two very different things, and that you needed both, working together to make anything last. For a while, they had it all. The best brands, the best territory, a partnership that made each man more effective than he would have been alone. Then, in 1887, Steinway pulled their franchise. The reasons were commercial. Steinway was tightening its distribution network, consolidating control over its dealer relationships across the country. It was not personal. But the effect was immediate and serious. D.H. Baldwin and Company had built a significant portion of its prestige on the Steinway name. Losing it meant losing a cornerstone. And for a company that had spent 25 years selling other people's instruments, there was suddenly a question on the table that had never been seriously asked before. What if they made their own? The question sat on the table through the winter of 1887 and into the following year. Buy from someone else or build their own? Buying from someone else was the safe answer. There were other manufacturers, other partnerships to negotiate. A company that had survived a fire, built a regional empire, and outlasted dozens of competitors could certainly find another supplier and keep moving. But Lucien Woolson had been watching the piano market long enough to know something important. The dealers who sold other people's instruments were always at the mercy of the people who made them. Margins were thin. Control was limited. The moment a manufacturer decided to change terms, the way Steinway just had, there was nothing to be done. You adapted or you shrank. Baldwin's answer, when it came, was characteristically his own. He did not frame the decision in the language of market positioning or competitive strategy. He framed it as a matter of principle. He would build, he declared, the best piano that could be built. That sentence would follow the company for the next 100 years. In 1890, Baldwin and Woolson purchased an abandoned lumber planing mill on the western edge of Eden Park, along Gilbert Avenue on Cincinnati's east side. The site was not glamorous, a working-class stretch of road, the smell of cut wood still hanging in the air, the hills of Eden Park rising across the street. But it had space, it had rail access, and it was theirs. They hired John Warren Macy, a piano technician and inventor of considerable skill, to design the instruments. Macy approached the work with the same seriousness Baldwin had demanded. The first piano built under their own roof was an upright model, completed in 1891 and shipped to the company's Cincinnati retail store. It sold, then another sold, then another. The factory on Gilbert Avenue grew. What had started as a single converted mill became a cluster of buildings, woodworking shops, finishing rooms, a small administrative office. Workers arrived. Men who knew how to bend wood under steam, how to stretch strings to precise tension, how to sand a spruce soundboard until it rang like a bell when you tapped it with one finger. These were craftsmen, not assemblers. The difference mattered because Baldwin had said the best, and the people on the floor took that seriously. In 1895, Macy completed the company's first grand piano, a 5-foot 4-inch model, designated Scale G. It was a precise, balanced instrument, built to hold its tuning under the stress of performance. Baldwin entered it in competitions. It won. Word spread in concert halls and music conservatories that something new had come out of Cincinnati. By the end of the decade, the single factory site had become a proper campus. Baldwin was no longer a retailer who also made instruments. It was a manufacturer with a growing national reputation, a retail network stretching from coast to coast, and a product that serious pianists were beginning to take seriously. Then, on August 23, 1899, Dwight Hamilton Baldwin died. He was 78 years old. He had spent nearly 4 decades building something he believed in, not primarily as a business, but as a contribution to American musical life. He had hired the right people, trusted them, and stepped back when they needed room. He had kept his name on the door without letting his ego fill the room. His will caused an immediate crisis. Baldwin had never married. He had no children. And in the end, the man who had spent his life in the church left 80% of his stake in the company he had founded, the company that bore his name, to the Presbyterian Church. Not to Wilson, not to his employees, not to the institution he had spent 40 years building, to the church. Wilson moved quickly. He negotiated the purchase of Baldwin's shares from the Presbyterian Church before the situation could unravel. The transaction was completed, the ownership consolidated, and the company, for the first time, belonged entirely to the family that would run it for the next 70 years. But the founder was gone. The man who had said, the best piano that could be built, would never see what that promise became. In 1 year's time, his company would send a grand piano to Paris, and the world would answer. Lucien Wilson shipped a Baldwin grand piano to Paris in the spring of 1900, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The Exposition Universelle was the largest World's Fair in history. 50 million visitors, 40 nations, the full spectacle of the industrial age on display along the banks of the Seine. Every major piano manufacturer in the world entered the competition. Steinway, Bosendorfer, Bechstein. The Europeans who had been making concert instruments for generations, whose names were carved into the walls of the great opera houses, whose reputations were measured not in decades, but in centuries. Baldwin was 9 years old as a manufacturer. When the jury announced its decision, the name they called was Baldwin. The Grand Prix, the highest honor at the most prestigious exhibition on earth, went to a company from Cincinnati, Ohio. It was the first time an American-made piano had ever won it. Lucien Wilson accepted the award and was decorated with the Cross of the Legion of Honor by the French government. He brought the medal home to Gilbert Avenue, where 2,000 miles away, men who had never heard of the Exposition Universelle were still showing up every morning to bend wood and stretch wire. 4 years later, Baldwin won again, the grand prize at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904. Then the grand prize at the Anglo-American Exposition in London, 1914. 3 continents, 3 decades, the same answer every time. The awards did something that advertising could not. They told the concert world that Baldwin was not a regional curiosity. It was a serious instrument, and serious musicians began to respond. Igor Stravinsky chose Baldwin. Bela Bartok chose Baldwin. Jose Iturbi, Wilhelm Backhaus, Walter Gieseking, the names on the Baldwin artist roster read like a program from Carnegie Hall. These were not endorsement deals in the modern sense. These were musicians who had played the instrument, compared it to the alternatives, and decided it was the one they wanted under their hands when the lights came up and the hall went quiet. Wilson understood the value of that association precisely, and he built around it. But he was not a man who let prestige obscure the numbers. He saw clearly that the great profitability of the company did not come from concert halls. It came from parlors, from living rooms in Indianapolis and Denver and Dallas, where parents who had never heard of Bartok wanted their children to have lessons and needed an instrument that was reliable, attractive, and affordable. The mass market, the household piano, was where Baldwin's survival actually lived. To reach that market, Wilson engineered something quietly revolutionary. Dealers across the country could receive Baldwin inventory by paying only the shipping cost up front. The full payment came only after the piano sold. Consumers could purchase on installment, paying Baldwin directly over time. In an era when most Americans could not write a check for a major purchase, This made Baldwin pianos accessible to families who wanted them but couldn't have afforded them otherwise. It was consumer financing applied to musical instruments, decades before it became standard practice in the American economy. The orders came in. The factory on Gilbert Avenue expanded again and again to meet them. By 1913, Baldwin was exporting to 32 countries. Showrooms operated in Cincinnati, Chicago, Dallas, Denver, Indianapolis, Louisville, New York, St. Louis, and San Francisco. The company that had been a single music store on the second floor of Pike's Opera House 50 years earlier now had a presence on 6 continents. Dwight Baldwin had wanted to build the best piano that could be built. Wilson had taken that promise and turned it into something Baldwin himself might not have imagined. A global brand, an American institution, a name that meant something from Paris to San Francisco. Then Lucien Wilson grew old, and his son stepped up. Lucien Wilson II was a different kind of man, quieter, more cautious, more interested in the long game than in the next award. He looked at the company his father had built and saw something his father may have missed, the ground shifting underneath it. A new technology was sweeping the piano market, mechanical, automated, thrilling to consumers and deeply profitable to manufacturers. Every company in the industry was chasing it. Wilson II decided Baldwin would chase it too. He would spend the next decade building the largest, most beautiful factory Cincinnati had ever seen, and filling it with a product that would vanish almost overnight. In 1921, Baldwin broke ground on a new factory. Not an expansion, not another building added to the existing campus. A single structure, 8 stories tall, built in the Italian Renaissance Revival style, with arched windows running the full height of the facade, 13-foot ceilings on every floor, and a clock tower rising above the roofline along Gilbert Avenue. The tower concealed a water tank feeding the building's fire suppression system. From the street, it looked like a civic monument. From the inside, it was a machine for making music. The project was budgeted at $1 million. It came in at $1,250,000. Nobody complained. When it was finished, it was the most impressive piano factory in the United States, possibly in the world, and everyone at Baldwin knew it. More than 2,000 workers came through those doors. Woodworkers who could read the grain of a spruce plank the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Finishers who applied lacquer in thin, even coats until the cabinet caught light like glass. String men who knew by touch when a wire was at exactly the right tension, not by instrument, by feel. Tuners who spent entire careers learning to hear fractions of a pitch that most people could not distinguish at all. In the first 5 years of the new factory, these men and women produced 11,000 pianos. The building was not just a workplace. For the neighborhood along Gilbert Avenue, it was an anchor, a place where a man without a college education could learn a precise and valuable trade, earn a steady wage, and take quiet pride in knowing that something he made with his hands would sit in a living room somewhere for 50 years, maybe longer, and still be playing. By the mid-1920s, more than 200 radio stations across the country preferred Baldwin's tone quality for their broadcasts. The sound of early American radio carried, in no small part, the resonance of a Baldwin grand. In 1924, First Lady Grace Coolidge selected a Baldwin for the White House, a choice that confirmed what the concert world already knew and told the rest of the country at the same time. Wilson II watched the factory rise and felt, for a moment, that the company was exactly where it was supposed to be. He was also watching something else, something that had been building since before the war and was now impossible to ignore. The player piano. The technology was not new. Mechanical instruments had existed in various forms for over a century. But by the early 1920s, the player piano had become the entertainment technology of the American middle class. You loaded a paper roll, You pumped the pedals, and the keys moved on their own. Scott Joplin, Irving Berlin, whatever was selling at the sheet music counter that week. No lessons required. No years of practice. Music in your living room, on demand, for anyone. The market exploded. By 1923, player pianos accounted for 56% of the total piano production in the United States. More than half. Baldwin built them. Every manufacturer built them. The money was extraordinary, and the demand seemed like it would never stop. Woolson II committed resources. The factory on Gilbert Avenue retooled sections of its floor to accommodate the additional complexity of player mechanisms. New workers were hired. New machinery was installed. The business case was obvious. If the market wanted player pianos, Baldwin would build the best player pianos that could be built. On the floor, the craftsmen who had spent years perfecting the acoustic instrument watched the shift with quiet unease. A player piano was not the same thing as a concert grand. It was a different product serving a different purpose, and some of them felt the distinction in their hands every time they worked on one. But the orders were coming in. The payroll was solid. Nobody said anything out loud. Then the ground gave way. Radio arrived first, not as a curiosity, but as a flood. By the mid-1920s, millions of American households had a receiver in the living room, pulling music out of the air for free. Why pump the pedals on a player piano when you could twist a dial and hear a full orchestra? Then came the phonograph, cheaper and more reliable than ever. Then the talkies. Silent films gave way to pictures with sound, and the pianists who had played in movie theaters across the country were out of work overnight. Then the automobile, pulling families out of their parlors and onto the open road on Sunday afternoons. Each of these things, on its own, might have been manageable. Together, they dismantled the cultural conditions that had made the piano, and especially the player piano, the center of American home entertainment. By 1929, player piano sales had collapsed 86% from their peak. Not declined. Collapsed. The technology that had seemed unstoppable 6 years earlier was now a warehouse full of unsold inventory and a factory floor configured to build something nobody wanted anymore. Then the stock market crashed. The Great Depression arrived in the fall of 1929 and took what remained. Pianos were expensive. Even modest uprights cost more than most working families earned in a month. In a country where men were standing in bread lines and banks were closing their doors, a piano was not a purchase anyone was making. The entire American piano industry produced just 51,000 instruments in 1932. The year before the player piano boom peaked, Baldwin alone had done better than that. Factories across the country closed. Companies that had been in business for generations simply stopped. The names disappeared from storefronts and shipping manifests, and the memory of the industry, one after another, through the early years of the Depression. Baldwin did not close. The reason was a decision Lucian Woolson II had made years earlier, quietly, without announcement. During the boom years when profits were strong and the temptation to spend everything on expansion was real. He had set aside reserves, large ones, a fund built precisely for the kind of catastrophe that everyone assumed would never come. While other companies had reinvested every dollar back into player piano production, Woolson II had held something back, a cushion, insurance against the unknown. It was not glamorous. It generated no headlines. No one wrote about it in the trade press during the good years. But when the Depression arrived and the orders stopped and the floor went quiet, that reserve fund was the reason 2,000 workers on Gilbert Avenue still had jobs. Fewer hours, reduced wages, painful adjustments all around. But jobs. Woolson II did something else during those lean years that would define the company's next generation. He did not simply wait for the market to recover. He invested in research. He initiated acoustic studies in partnership with the University of Cincinnati. Serious scientific work on the physics of sound production in a piano, on how the shape of a soundboard affected resonance, on what made one instrument ring and another fall flat. While the rest of the industry was trying to survive, Baldwin was trying to understand. By 1936, the market had begun to breathe again. The National Piano Manufacturers Association reported that sales in the first 6 months of that year were the highest in 15 years. Baldwin introduced the Acrosonic, a compact vertical piano designed for smaller homes and tighter budgets, built with the same standards that had won Grand Prix awards in Paris, offered at a price that the recovering middle class could actually reach. It sold steadily, then well, then very well. The 8-story palace on Gilbert Avenue was still standing. The clock tower still marked the hours above Gilbert Avenue. The craftsmen were still there, older now, quieter, carrying the memory of the boom and the silence of the Depression in the same pair of hands. They had survived. But the next test was already on its way, and this time, it would not come from the market. It would come from the United States government. The letter from Washington arrived in 1942 and left no room for negotiation. The United States War Production Board had made its decision. All domestic piano manufacturing was to cease immediately. The factories would be retooled. The materials, the spruce, the maple, the felt, the wire, would be redirected. America was at war, and America needed something other than music. For a company that had spent 50 years perfecting the construction of acoustic instruments, the order was disorienting in ways that went beyond the economic. Piano making was not an assembly process. It was a craft built on accumulated knowledge, on the understanding that wood behaves differently depending on where it was cut and how long it had dried, that the angle of a hammer strike affects tone in ways that cannot be fully calculated, that a soundboard must be shaped and graduated by hand because no two pieces of spruce are identical. You could not simply stop and start again. The knowledge lived in the hands of the people on the floor, and idle hands forgot things. But the order stood. And Baldwin, as it had done before, adapted. The factory on Gilbert Avenue was retooled for military production. The woodworking equipment, the same machines that had shaped piano cabinets and bent curved lids, was redirected toward a new purpose: aircraft components. Baldwin's expertise in precision woodworking made it a natural fit for a military that was still, in the early years of the war, building training aircraft with wooden frames and plywood skins. Baldwin factories produced structural components for 2 aircraft in particular. The first was the Aeronca PT-23, a 2-seat primary trainer used to teach thousands of American pilots the fundamentals of flight before they moved on to more powerful machines. The second was the Curtiss Wright C-76 Caravan, a cargo aircraft designed to conserve aluminum by using wood construction throughout. The C-76 was an ambitious project that ultimately failed. The aircraft proved too heavy and too slow, and the program was canceled before full production began. But Baldwin had already built the components, and the workers had already learned what it meant to construct an airframe out of laminated wood under precise engineering tolerances. Those lessons turned out to be worth more than anyone expected. The men and women who spent the war years shaping plywood wing skins and fuselage panels came back to piano making with a new understanding of what laminated wood could do under stress. How layers bonded under pressure behaved differently from solid lumber. How the direction of the grain in each layer affected the strength and stability of the whole. They brought that understanding back to the instrument. Baldwin's engineers applied it directly. The pin block, the thick block of wood into which the tuning pins are driven, one of the most mechanically stressed components in a piano, had traditionally been made from solid maple. Baldwin redesigned it as a laminated structure, bonding multiple layers of maple with alternating grain directions. The result was a block that held tuning pins more firmly, resisted the constant tension of the strings more reliably, and degraded more slowly over decades of use. Baldwin received a patent for the 41-ply maple pin block design in 1956. It became one of the defining technical features of the post-war Baldwin sound. The war ended in 1945. The government order was lifted. The factory on Gilbert Avenue went back to making pianos. But the men who returned to those workbenches were not quite the same men who had left them. They had spent 3 years building machines designed to carry human beings into the sky. They had worked to military tolerances under military oversight, with the understanding that a mistake in their work could cost a pilot his life. That standard, precise, unforgiving, consequential, came back with them to the piano floor. It showed in what they built. By 1946, Baldwin had introduced its first electronic organ, a technology the company had been quietly developing since 1935. The research interrupted by the war and now finally ready for the market. The instrument was an immediate success. Churches bought them. Schools bought them. The living rooms of post-war America filling rapidly with the optimism of a country that had won and was now building, bought them. The organ division grew so quickly that the company changed its name, Baldwin Piano and Organ Company. A new era had begun. And the 8-story building on Gilbert Avenue, its clock tower still keeping time above the roofline, its floors humming again with the sound of work, was at the center of it. For the next 2 decades, everything Baldwin touched would turn to gold. But somewhere in the distance, just beyond what anyone could see from the factory floor, a fire was already being lit. America came home from the war and went shopping, not just for cars and refrigerators and houses in the new suburbs spreading out from every major city, though it bought all of those too, in numbers that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. It bought pianos. Millions of families who had spent the Depression years doing without, and the war years doing their part, were now, for the first time in a generation, in a position to spend. And what they wanted to spend on, among other things, was music. Real music. A piano in the living room, lessons for the children, the sound of something being learned and practiced and gradually imperfectly mastered. Baldwin was ready. The factory on Gilbert Avenue was running at full capacity. The Arkansas plant at Conway, begun in 1959, added production for upright models, taking pressure off the Cincinnati campus and allowing Gilbert Avenue to focus on the instruments that required the most skilled hands, the grands, the studio models, the instruments that would end up on concert stages and in serious music schools. A second southern plant followed in Greenwood, Mississippi, in 1961. The network was expanding, the output was climbing, and the name Baldwin was appearing in more American homes than at any previous point in the company's history. In 1952, President Harry Truman sat down at a Baldwin piano during the first televised tour of the White House. The broadcast went out to a country still adjusting to the idea of seeing its government on a screen in the living room. Millions of Americans watched, and what they saw, in the background of that historic broadcast, was a Baldwin. That kind of visibility could not be bought. It could only be earned by building an instrument good enough that the people who chose pianos for the White House kept choosing the same one. The artist roster told the same story. Aaron Copland, the most distinctly American voice in classical composition, became a Baldwin artist in 1945. Liberace, whose television appearances in the early 1950s made him the most watched pianist in the country, performed exclusively on Baldwin. Dave Brubeck, whose 1959 album Time Out introduced jazz to a generation of college students who had never thought much about jazz, played Baldwin. Marion McPartland, who would spend decades broadcasting piano conversations on public radio, played Baldwin. These were not peripheral figures. They were the people shaping what American music sounded like, and they had all made the same choice. Lucien Woolson III became president in 1961. He inherited a company at the height of its power, financially strong, artistically respected, operationally expanding. He was the third consecutive Lucien Woolson to run Baldwin, the third generation of a family that had guided the company from a single converted lumber mill to a national institution. The continuity was extraordinary. Most American companies of comparable age had passed through a dozen different ownership structures, been reorganized, sold, merged, and remade. Baldwin had stayed in the same hands, the same family name, the same address on Gilbert Avenue, the same commitment to the standard that Dwight Baldwin had set in 1890. In 1963, Woolson III made the most ambitious acquisition in company history. Baldwin purchased C. Bechstein Pianoforte Fabrik, the legendary German manufacturer whose instruments had been played by Liszt, Debussy, and Brahms, whose name was spoken in European concert halls with the same reverence Americans reserved for Steinway. The acquisition put Baldwin in a different category entirely. Not just the best American piano company, a major player in the global concert instrument market, with a European flagship brand to match its domestic one. The future looked wide open. On the factory floor at Gilbert Avenue, the men who had been there since before the war watched it all with a particular kind of satisfaction. They had built the instruments that sat in the White House. They had built the grands that Copland and Brubeck played. They had shown up every morning for decades, through the Depression, through the war years when the building made airplane parts instead of piano keys, through the lean post-war years when the market was finding its footing, and they had kept the standard. The 41-ply pin block, the graduated soundboard, the precision that the work required and that they had spent careers acquiring. By 1974, Baldwin would sell its 1 millionth piano. Steinway, which had a 20-year head start in manufacturing and a century-long head start in prestige, had reached 600,000. The number said something about the scale of what Baldwin had built, about how deeply the name had embedded itself in American musical life. But even in the early 1960s, something was shifting that the sales figures did not fully capture. The brand was moving down market. The push to reach the baby boom generation, to put a Baldwin in every home where parents wanted lessons for their children, had been commercially successful, but it had gradually repositioned the name. Baldwin was no longer primarily associated with the concert stage. It was associated with the school recital, the church fellowship hall, the living room where a 10-year-old practiced scales on Tuesday afternoons. There was nothing wrong with that. There was enormous money in it. But the distance between that market and the Bechstein acquisition, between the family upright and the European concert grand, was wider than it might have appeared from the executive floor. Woolson III was managing a company that was simultaneously trying to be the most prestigious piano brand in the world and the most accessible. The tension between those two ambitions was manageable, as long as everything else held steady. Then, on the night of March 4th, 1964, everything stopped being steady. It started with a fire in a basement. A wrecking crew clearing land for the new Interstate 71 had been burning debris, routine work done carelessly. The flames were supposed to stay in an outdoor pit. They did not. They found the wooden buildings on the northern edge of the Baldwin campus, 4 7-story structures used to store lumber, raw materials, and finished components. And they moved fast. By 8 p.m., the fire had its own momentum. 5 alarms were pulled. More than 600 firefighters responded from across the tri-state area. 32 fire trucks lined Gilbert Avenue. The flames climbed 200 feet into the night sky, hot enough to blister the paint off 3 fire trucks and melt the crane of an excavator caught at the edge of the inferno. Extra police were called in to hold back thousands of onlookers who had come to watch the sky burn. The firefighters formed a line 75 feet from the main building, the 8-story palace, the clock tower, the heart of everything. And they held it. They poured water through the night and into the following morning. By dawn, 4 7-story buildings were gone. The main building was still standing. But production in Cincinnati was over. The machinery that had survived was relocated. The workers who had spent their careers on Gilbert Avenue were told the work was moving south, to Conway, to Greenwood, to places where costs were lower and the union contracts were different. Some of them found other work. Some of them didn't. The neighborhood along Gilbert Avenue, which had built its rhythms around the factory, the shift changes, the lunch counters, the sense of a place that made something real and valuable, felt the absence immediately. The 8-story building stood empty in the mornings now. The clock tower kept its hours. But the floors were quiet, and the craftsmen were gone, and the thing that had happened there for 70 years was not happening anymore. In the executive offices, the men who ran Baldwin looked at what remained and began to ask a question that would have seemed absurd to Dwight Baldwin and troubling to any of the 3 Lucian Wilsons. The question was this: what if the real money was never in the pianos at all? The question had a seductive logic to it. Baldwin had been financing pianos for decades. Ever since Lucian Wilson I pioneered the installment model in the early 20th century, letting customers pay over time rather than all at once, the company had been, in effect, a lender as much as a manufacturer. Dealers received inventory against future payment. Families signed payment plans. Money moved through Baldwin's books in ways that looked less like a factory ledger and more like a bank's. By the 1970s, the men running the company had done the arithmetic and arrived at an uncomfortable truth. The financing operation was generating better returns than the piano operation. The margins on lending, on collecting interest, on managing a portfolio of installment contracts were cleaner, more predictable, and more scalable than the margins on building instruments. Wood warped. Skilled labor was expensive. Quality control required constant attention. Money, properly managed, just compounded. The leap from that observation to the next decision was not as large as it should have been. Baldwin moved into financial services. Not tentatively, not as a side operation to support the instrument business, but aggressively, as a primary growth strategy. The company began acquiring savings and loan institutions, extending its lending portfolio into real estate, building a financial services division that had nothing to do with pianos, organs, or anything that made sound. The logic was simple. They already knew how to lend money. Now they would lend it at scale. Through the late 1970s, the strategy appeared to be working. The financial services division grew rapidly. Revenue climbed. The Baldwin name, still respected, still associated in the public mind with quality and American craftsmanship, gave the financial operation a credibility it might not have had under a different banner. Investors were comfortable. Analysts were positive. The people running the company believed they had found a way to use the Baldwin brand as a platform for something much larger than pianos. What they had actually found was a way to destroy it. The savings and loan industry in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a landscape of accelerating risk. Deregulation had opened the sector to aggressive lending practices. Interest rates were volatile. Real estate markets in key regions were overheating. The institutions that had moved fastest and lent most aggressively were the ones most exposed when conditions changed, and conditions always changed. Baldwin had moved fast. Baldwin had lent aggressively. And when the market turned, the exposure was catastrophic. In 1983, the D.H. Baldwin Company filed for bankruptcy. The total liabilities came to $9 billion, the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the United States up to that point. Not the largest piano company bankruptcy, the largest bankruptcy, period, of any American company, in any industry, at any time. $9 billion. Built not from bad pianos, but from bad loans. The musical instrument division was carved out and sold separately. It survived. The name, the product line, the remaining manufacturing operations in Arkansas and Mississippi. But it survived as an orphan, cut loose from the financial wreckage of a parent company that had forgotten what business it was actually in. The Wilson family was gone. 3 generations, Lucien I, Lucien II, Lucien III, had guided the company from a converted lumber mill to a global brand over nearly a century. Now the name on the door was the name of a bankruptcy proceeding, and the family that had carried it was no longer part of the story. The building on Gilbert Avenue had already been standing empty for years. After production moved south following the 1964 fire, the 8-story palace had served briefly as office space before that, too, was abandoned. By the early 1980s, it sat on Gilbert Avenue the way a lot of things from that era sat. Present, solid, and disconnected from the purpose that had given it meaning. The clock tower still turned. The arched windows still faced Eden Park across the street, but there was nobody inside, and no reason to go in. The instrument company changed hands and changed hands again through the late 1980s. The Wurlitzer name was acquired in 1988. Another great American instrument brand. Another company that had outlasted its original circumstances and was now being absorbed into a consolidating industry. The Chickering name came along with it. Baldwin was becoming a portfolio of historic American piano brands, held together by the same logic that had assembled the financial services empire. Names had value, and if you owned enough of them, the value added up. It was a reasonable theory. It was also a slow retreat. The competition arriving from Asia through the 1980s and 1990s was not competing on prestige. Japanese manufacturers, Yamaha, Kawai, had spent decades mastering precision manufacturing at industrial scale. Their instruments were reliable, consistent, and significantly less expensive than American-made equivalents. Korean manufacturers followed. The market that had sustained Baldwin's household piano business, the parents buying instruments for children's lessons, the schools and churches outfitting their practice rooms, was exactly the market where Asian competition was strongest. Price mattered there. Brand heritage helped, but it did not close the gap. Baldwin responded by moving more production south, then further south, then eventually offshore. The Conway, Arkansas facility kept running through the 1990s, producing grand pianos for the American market, and the workers there maintained standards that people inside the industry still respected. But the trajectory was visible to anyone paying attention. The company was shrinking toward a core it wasn't sure how to defend. By 2001, Baldwin was in bankruptcy again. The second time was quieter than the first. No $9 billion headlines, no record books rewritten. Just a company that had run out of runway and needed someone to take it over. The someone who answered was Gibson Guitar Corporation, based in Nashville, Tennessee. A guitar company buying a piano company. The symmetry was either poetic or ironic, depending on how you looked at it. Gibson had its own complicated history, its own near-death experiences, its own questions about how to protect a great American instrument brand in a market that no longer rewarded sentiment. They understood the problem, even if they weren't sure they could solve it. For 7 years, they tried. Production continued at Truman, Arkansas. The craftsmen who remained, fewer now, older, working with the knowledge that the window was closing, kept building. The instruments that came off that line in the early 2000s were good. People inside the piano world knew it. The Baldwin Grand still had a sound that serious players recognized, a clarity in the upper register, and a warmth in the bass that the Asian manufacturers had not fully replicated. But good was not enough anymore. Not at the price point American labor required. In December of 2008, Gibson made the decision that everyone had seen coming and nobody wanted to say out loud. The last American Baldwin piano rolled off the line at Truman, Arkansas. No ceremony, no press release that anyone remembers. The workers clocked out, and the machines went quiet. And 146 years of American piano manufacturing ended in a building in a small Arkansas town that most of the country had never heard of. Everything moved to China. The 8-story building on Gilbert Avenue, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, its Italian Renaissance Revival facade still intact, its clock tower still marking the hours above the roofline, was converted to loft apartments in 2017. The developers named it the Baldwin. People live there now. They look out through the arched windows at Eden Park across the street, at the hills where the lumber mill once stood, at the city that Dwight Baldwin arrived in, with nothing but a gift for music and a belief that the best piano that could be built was worth building. The clock tower is still there. The water tank inside it, installed in 1921 to feed the fire suppression system, has never been needed for a fire in the main building. The building that survived everything, the fire that took the warehouses, the bankruptcy that took the company, the decades that took the workers, is now full of people who may or may not know what happened on those floors. Somewhere in China, a piano with the Baldwin name on the fallboard is being assembled today. It will be shipped to a dealer. A family will buy it. A child will sit down and begin, badly, to learn. Dwight Hamilton Baldwin would have recognized that moment. It was, in the end, what he had been working toward all along. Not the Grand Prix, not the White House, not the million pianos. Just a child. Just a room. Just the sound of music being learned. One imperfect note at a time.